Hello, everybody. Thank you for either coming or tuning in. So we're very pleased to have today Fred Cohen from Schneider Electric. He's been with the company since 2001. He's a senior program director for the product security office, where he's keenly interested in the secure development life cycle and is heading up educational efforts within Schneider to do that as well. He comes to us with a double-E degree from University of Maryland and an MBA, so he knows his business. But we're very delighted that he's here to talk to us so we can learn from him, and perhaps he can learn from us as well. So, Fred.
Thank you. Just a clarification, I did restart with Schneider in 2001, but I actually had 5 years of hiatus with a quote-unquote startup that never started up. And I had 10 years with the company before that. So for my service award, I don't want my service award to be shortened here, so just make sure I get all my credit for the time. Thank you all for joining. You mentioned Fred Cohen. I'm from Boston, so although I'm originally from Baltimore, so if I don't sound like I'm from Boston, there's a very good reason. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is cybersecurity, acknowledging the range of the world that Schneider lives in, which starts at IoT and ends in nuclear. And what I mean by nuclear is we make nuclear control systems, nuclear safety shutdown systems. So we participate in nuclear generation. So when we talk about criticality, the importance of a very simple sensor all the way up to dealing with the challenges of what most considered to be one of the most security conscious environments you could be in. In some parts of the world, we do equipment in nuclear processing as well. So yeah, we deal with all of that stuff. So what you see on the left, and you might not be aware, but Schneider also makes a intelligent thermostat. So that's kind of, I wouldn't say that's the bottom end of what we do from a sophistication, but it's a $100 to $200 thermostat to try to compete with Nest. And it's a communication device, and it connects to a hosted service, and it's web-enabled, and it sits on the internet, and like everything else in the world of IoT, it's a target. So we deal with the targets from the full range. So who am I? David gave me a nice intro. My background, right now I'm leading the product security office in Schneider Electric. And as he mentioned, our primary activity is in the processes and driving the consistency of deploying the right development processes across the R&D community. I also am responsible for our PCERT, so any incident response, mostly dealing with vulnerability management. So we deal with all the vulnerabilities that are reported by cybersecurity researchers, make sure that we do responsible disclosure. I also am responsible for leading incident response in the event of an event of some kind at a customer site, and we have had a few of those. We don't really make press about that, but to be very candid, we have had situations where our products have either been allegedly attacked and turns out it was nothing, all the way to, yes, our products were targeted. So we've dealt with the full range of those things. So my background is industrial control. I spent about 2 years in the protective relay world, very, very early in my career. They look very different than they did back then. So anyone who's involved in the utility knows probably what a protective relay is. Or as you might not realize, they are actually called IEDs, which makes for an interesting discussion when you describe to somebody that the IED that we sell, and people kind of turn their head. And so I prefer to call them protective relays, but the industry does call them IEDs, which is an interesting acronym. But I quickly moved into the industrial control and ended up dealing with the PLCs, variable speed drives, any kind of intelligent automation. That's been my background. And I migrated from there into the industrial networking. So we were one of the early innovators of applying TCP/IP technology to industrial control products. So that opened up a whole set of opportunities for communication. Prior to that, most of the communications were all proprietary. So now we were able to enable active communication to standard PCs and Windows and using web browsers and things like that, which really opened up a lot of opportunities. And as we've since learned, has also created a lot of challenges. But at the time, it was pretty innovative and considered risky more because of a performance and reliability and availability standpoint, because at the time it was still, are you sure TCP/IP is robust enough and available enough that you could theoretically exceed your limits? Well, we now know that 1 gigabit network can handle pretty much any Modbus communication problem you would ever have. So in that discussion, we started looking at security, and candidly, we met with some companies that made packet-aware firewalls and started looking at maybe we should try to sell these things and finding out what the interest in security was from our asset customers. And so we did a number of these things that for anyone who's been involved in the business side, it's called voice of the customer, where you go out and try to elicit their interests, elicit their problems, and try to map what their trends are and what their interests and what their concerns are. And we really struck out on cybersecurity, to be honest. I did about 3 rounds of this going back into the early 2000s and really never got anywhere. And then, as we say, how did I get involved? The funny thing happened, Stuxnet. And all of a sudden it became, we've been trying to help our customer really protect from fairly benign problems. Now we have a very serious problem. Interesting side note, I had a salesman contact me right after this and said, I think he was from South America somewhere, but I won't bother trying to give the accent. But he said, listen, I'm wondering, can we promote that our products are more secure because we were not susceptible to Stuxnet? And my answer was, no. I said, as we said, there but for the grace of God go I. The only reason we were not attacked by Stuxnet is because we didn't get the order. If we had gotten the order for that system running in their facility, we would have been the one attacked. So please don't tell your customer that we're more secure. So that was kind of how this thing started. So I'm a relative novice in the context of IT for cybersecurity, but as I learned in the world of OT, maybe I'm more middle-aged. So who is Schneider? Schneider's about 25 billion euro in sales from last year. Obviously we haven't reported 2017 yet. We're north of 144,000 employees, located in 100 plus countries. We're on 6 continents. As far as I know, we have no footprint in Antarctica, but we're pretty much everywhere else. And we put about 5% of revenues to R&D. Some key things that are most important to us is being a global specialist in energy management and automation. And then as I was alluding to earlier, everything from the simplest of switches all the way up to very complex operational systems, running pipelines and transportation systems and, as I said, nuclear processing, and we make distributed control systems running refineries. So we run the gamut all the way from very simple to very complex. Most people don't know who Schneider is. So the types of businesses we're in, the core businesses, we're in data centers. So we make UPS. We're one of the largest manufacturers of UPSs in the world, and power management and cooling. The APC brand might be familiar to you, but that's a company of Schneider. We're in building management, so we do temperature control, access control, metering, and protection. So in a building like this, we would be doing the controls we do campus-wide, we do critical building, we do regular buildings, we do small office. We run the gamut there. Square D makes our metering and protection. Andover Controls makes building management. On the utility side, we make protective relays, substation controllers, and even some transformers. We're not big in transmission. We're more at the substation distribution level. That's mostly Areva. Industrial control, we are made up of a number of acquisitions, all the way from little sensors for machine, limit switches and proc switches, all the way up to DCSs, safety PLCs, shutdown systems. And that's a combination of acquisition from Invensys, Telemecanique, and if you're not familiar with Europe, electrical equipment, Merlin-Gerin is the same, kind of the equivalent to Square D in Europe. They make all the little breakers in your house or in the walls or things like that. So that's kind of the range of who Schneider is. These are the different core markets we're in. We're organized in business units. So the data center and building management are in one business unit. The electric utility offering is in a second business unit, and the industrial is in a third business unit. What you'll find is that, and one of the challenges of Schneider is a controller in a building looks an awful lot like a controller for an industrial process and looks an awful lot like a controller used in a substation. And trying to get those to be harmonized and common technologies and common platforms is continuously a challenge for a company of our size. They don't tend to impose as much as other peers of ours, but we do try to get standardization and try to get to share technologies. Why that's important, how it manifests itself is, if you're thinking from a cybersecurity standpoint, one of the challenges of cybersecurity is supply chain. And supply chain involves your third-party suppliers. And if you have every product department making their own controller, using their own operating system, keeping track of the vulnerability reports from all these different suppliers can be a bit nightmarish. So if you can concentrate your activities within a certain number of suppliers, you have a better chance of managing your supply chain. So our purchasing people certainly like to manage the supply chain. We also like to manage the supply chain from a security standpoint as far as dealing with patching, and because patching an embedded system is nothing like patching Windows. I know it can be aggravating patching Windows, but when you download Tuesday, usually you can just push it out, or I see a lot of Macs, so sorry, but you don't have to deal with that nightmare. But that's I'm sure you have your own challenges. But when you're dealing with embedded systems, these things are all integrated. You cannot just patch operating system to a running application. You've got to rebuild, reload, and test, and test again. So it makes a much more difficult problem. So I don't know, I assume most of you understand this distinction of IT versus OT. IT controls electrons, OT controls molecules. So we deal with the OT world mostly, but we do participate in data centers, but we're mostly moving the molecules in the data centers. So we're not the servers, we're not doing the applications. We're keeping the environment comfortable for these servers to run and do their thing. So we are very active in places, I probably shouldn't mention names, some of the cloud providers and some of the big social media companies, we actually participate there. We provide the facility management, the cooling of the racks, and the power distribution and things like that. So we participate in those types of businesses, but we're not doing servers and we're not doing the IT side. So one of the classic differences of priorities is availability over integrity and confidentiality, although there's a lot of people that are uncomfortable with integrity being different than availability. So let's say AI are equal, but confidentiality tends to be much lower. It's possible you have an environment where the recipes are secure and you want to protect them from some kind of confidentiality or breach or thing. But for the most part, the value that's running across the wire just doesn't mean that much. It's more about making sure that when you intend to send a value, that the actual value, the correct value gets there. So integrity and availability. But the other piece is we're heavily involved in life safety activities, things that cause things to explode and things that can kill people. So we don't like to trivialize that, and we take this very, very seriously. So it's very important to us to make sure that when we're dealing with cybersecurity aspects, we are sensitive to the fact that any impact potentially could hurt somebody if these systems are attacked. So that's kind of the general nature of what we do. So why is OT a soft target? And I can tell you there are probably more than a few of our customers who follow this philosophy. They're generally older, and they're generally built insecure by design. When these products are installed, they have a life cycle of 15, 20 years. In some cases, utilities even longer, because that's kind of the rule. So the owners don't tend to have the cybersecurity skills that we expect from an IT organization. And I work a lot with our corporate IT people, and it's kind of inherent in them about how to secure the system, and obviously the need to secure the system, and obviously the need to change your passwords, and obviously the need to patch your product. That mindset is not quite there yet on the asset owners of OT world, because they're equally concerned about safety and can I access the system. If I have to make a decision and I got to act on a system and it's late at night and it's not the guy who deals with it, on a normal sleep pattern, he's on the night shift sleep pattern, and he's got to make a quick decision. And whose system is it? Is it his system or it's the shared system? Can I access it? Can I turn that switch off electrically without causing a problem? These skills, they aren't comfortable yet with the password intrusion. So they'll tend to share passwords, and they're not really their equipment. They're shared from the population. So it's a different world. And a big problem is they're naive. Who's going to attack us? No one's going to go after my HVAC system. No one's going to try to change the temperature of my HVAC system. Well, if anyone ever followed the Target breach and you had a credit card replaced because of that, the threat vector, the attack vector was through the HVAC system. So I try to remind, especially we deal a lot with facilities management people, please don't think that just because you're only controlling temperature that you aren't a vector. You might not be the target, but you might be a means to the end. So if there is any good news, when they do a kill chain of a computing system, it's pretty well studied, and doing a kill chain on a control system is very different, and it requires a lot more evaluation of the environment, and also then it requires another whole level of activity to go figure out what data actually will cause something, because you probably want to cause something to blow up if you're attacking a control system, or you want to cause something to shut down, which might cause something to blow up. So this is kind of your objective, and being able to do that in these control systems, because they're designed to fail safe. Inherently, that's their fundamental design, is fail safe. So when you cause a disruption, normally they will fail safe. Now, failing or shutting down might be the objective, but blowing up is a whole nother level of difficulty. So in most cases, it's much harder to do that kind of damage to a control system. So if there's a silver lining in this, that does give us a little bit of relief. But we do know that the attackers are getting pretty savvy at things they can do. So it certainly causes a few sleepless nights in our company. So then because all this is so obvious and so easy and so secure and so safe, we decided that we're going to take this industrial environment and connect it to a cloud environment. Because why not, right? Seems reasonable. So this is a big trend. And it's called IIoT, which didn't realize there are 4-letter acronyms, so that's good. Not very creative. It's Industrial Internet of Things. And basically what it says is, in the industrial world, I want to make remote connections to the environment so that I can either collect data or actually make changes to systems remotely. Well, why would I, in any case, want to do that? There's been a trend for a long time in reducing headcount, centralizing the subject matter expertise, and being able to manage a much wider territory with a lot fewer people. This probably sounds very familiar to most industries, and if I was at the business school, you'd be probably nodding your head saying, yeah, I heard the same thing, doing more with less. Well, so what they're trying to do now is using cloud and internet technologies make my use of resources more efficient. So it could be a cloud-based building management system, and we sold one of these to a bank that had a series of retail establishments, and you put a small controller in each one, but you put the main brains up in a central place. So you don't have to manage the environment at the site, you manage it all centrally. Facility monitoring, so how do you help? So you might not be because they can't monitor the facility, but they might not have the expertise. So now we provide a service of expertise, or we provide a vehicle by which you can give it to your experts. Remote asset management. Asset management's a big deal. I got to know what devices are there. Invariably, we'll go out to an environment and say, so what do you have in your installation? And they'll show you a diagram, and it's out of date. You do a quick scan of the network, and you're like, well, what's this? I don't know. That's not that. Oh, that's not on our network. Yeah, it is on your network now. You might not know what it is, but so asset management's a big deal. And then what version of patch is it at? That's a huge problem. Wages. You all think now I'm talking about salary. Water, air, gas, electric, steam. I just put that up there just because I like to be able to tell people that I know an acronym, five-letter acronym. And remote robotic surgery. So I was talking to somebody here earlier they're looking at robotics, and so remote surgery, it is, and they do that over the internet. So that's not our world, we're not in that, but it is a IIoT type application. So what are the risks? You could get to personal data, so if personal data is accessible somehow through this connection, puts it at risk. The equipment can be attacked if you're not properly protecting it, making sure that any communication to it is authenticated, and making sure you have the rights to do what you're trying to do. Of course, the integrity part, can data be manipulated or modified? The equipment could be damaged, and of course, that directly could mean life safety impact. So there's a lot of scary threats about IIoT. That's not stopping people from doing it, but it certainly puts it pause why security is so important in the IIoT world. So what are we doing about this? We have a kind of I guess I would say, a five-prong approach from an R&D standpoint. So that's really what the rest of my talk today is. I've kind of set the stage for the markets we're in, the things that are happening in the market, the big trends, why there's some concerns, and now what are we doing about it from an R&D standpoint. And I put an obligatory Game of Thrones picture up here because I was at a conference last week, and it seemed like everybody had a Game of Thrones picture of some kind. In fact, multiple people from different companies had the same picture on the screen. I didn't put that picture up there, but I felt like my presentation would be way out of date if I didn't have at least one shout out to Game of Thrones. So it has really nothing to do with my R&D, but it is a journey. So the five-prong element: standards-based development practices, consistency rules. I'll talk more about what they are. Bricks and platforms to optimize your development and take some of the creativity away in order to make sure that the right functionality is there. And then making innovative designs that are suited to the markets, because I gave you a pretty broad cross-section of markets that we have to target. And so making sure that these are innovative, that can be serving the market appropriately. And then some of the research activities. I'll show you some of the research activities at the very end that we're focused on. So we start with a a development methodology that provides practices that people are expected to follow in order to do the right thing. So back 20 years ago, it was the quality mantra, and quality mantra was executed with ISO 9000. And if you didn't do ISO 9000, you obviously didn't understand quality. But if you did ISO 9000, that didn't mean you made a quality product. But it meant that you understood enough about quality that you should have made a quality product, because if you're doing the practices with the right intent, then it should result in a quality product. If you did them if you had like a side team whose job it was to document for the ISO 9000 auditors, this is what we say we do, and then the rest of the group does what they want to do, you didn't solve anything. So this is very similar. Secure development lifecycle are a set of practices that if you do them right, and you do them with the right intent, and you do them at the right time during development, you should end up with a quote unquote, I shouldn't say secure product because there's no such thing as a secure product, a product that you are properly managing from a security standpoint. So we started this journey shortly after I mentioned that I got into cybersecurity, and we started with ISO 27034, which is a methodology developed by Microsoft, and they documented it and put it into an ISO standard. And we've now migrated to an IEC standard, which is 62443. If you're not familiar with the IEC standards, it's a whole suite of, I'll talk in a minute about that. It's a suite of standards for industrial applications, cybersecurity standards for industrial. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then we use an ISO standard for vulnerability management. So one of our challenges of responsible vulnerability management is to make sure we don't violate any, we don't put ourselves at legal risk. So making sure we follow a proper vulnerability disclosure practice based on ISO. So even our IT organization, who didn't really understand what SDL was, surprisingly, are now starting to embrace it as a methodology, because they're now also getting challenged. An interesting thing is happening, and it's not just because of the hosted environment, but we're now having some customers come to us and say, you want to sell us your control system, show us the development practices that you follow in order to show us that you are doing the right thing. And so we then go through some audit practice. And they say, okay, show us the practices that your IT organization follows. And we're like, well, what's that have to do with our product? Well, they say, if we say, eat your own food, do you practice what you preach? So our IT organization, which really isn't that closely connected to our product development, although they kind of oversee the network and little things like that, and source code repository, but details. They are now starting to embrace secure development lifecycle in their development, which is a big boon. We even have some development organizations that are certified for their practices. It's still fairly young in our maturity, but we do have probably 7 or 8 departments of our R&D organization that have been certified that they follow the practices, which is can be something we can promote. So 62443 has 8 development practices that probably look pretty obvious from a development standpoint. And so when you're participating in 62443, each one of these practices has a series of activities that you're expected to do. And then if they're going to audit you for conformance, then you'll be expected to demonstrate artifacts that comply with these. So these are the practices, and so we're instantiating this into our secure development lifecycle policy, which is mandatory for all development entities. Governance of it is always a journey, so as I mentioned, it's a journey. But this will be instantiated in our development practices. IEC 62443 is actually 12, or I think now it's 13 standards, which includes secure development lifecycle. It also includes how system integrators put systems in place, how asset owners should be deploying systems securely, how do you make a secure product, how do you make a secure system, targeted to industrial, but our company has kind of embraced it. Even though there are other departments that don't serve the industrial market, they've embraced the methodologies because they're generic enough that makes sense for all of them. So it's kind of a set of standards that our company has embraced, not just our industrial sectors. The next piece is consistency rules. So these are things that govern how you should accomplish something. So if you're going to, I remember one of the simple ones, if you're going to make a 9-pin serial connector to communicate Modbus protocol, you had to make sure the pinouts were this way. Because invariably what was happening is you would take two products from Schneider with a 9-pin pinout. Both said they talked Modbus serial, and the pinouts didn't match. So if you wanted a cable to this one, you had to buy this cable. If you wanted a cable to that one, you had to buy that cable. And I will tell you, cabling is not that profitable that it's worth having that many different cables. So our manufacturing facility would be loaded up with all these different cables when all you were doing was a 9-pin serial. So we're like, this is silly. So that was one of the early instantiations of a consistency rule. If you're going to do it, this is how you do it. So we're using this model, and it has marketing rules, like these are the requirements you must put into a product, or technical rules. This is how you must implement some feature or some capability. And those rules then can be segment-oriented, or they can be transversal to the company. So we use this methodology as a way to make sure that products are as consistent as they can be in certain areas where we're concerned or we have anxiety about people going off their own path. So these are some of the examples of ones in the security world that we've just that we're managing are robustness testing, software signing, firmware signing, because firmware has to be treated very differently than software when you sign it, and secure boot. So this is, again, something into the product. So these are what we call invariants that we're putting into place, and we're putting infrastructures in place to deploy these. The technical part is a lot less challenging than the manufacturing. I will tell you that's probably our biggest challenge, is getting them through the supply chain, because it's practices that have to be coordinated with our various manufacturing plants, and we do a fair amount of third-party subcontractor subassembly, so it gets very complicated. Software signing is not so complicated because Microsoft makes it easy. They will reject your software if it's not signed. So there's kind of a market force there that says if you want to launch a Windows application and it's not signed, Microsoft will put big warning signs on your computer. So it does make it a little easier. The next step is, okay, I have a rule, but how do you help me implement that rule? So we have a model of bricks and platforms, and we use those two terms as complementary. They are not the same. To us, a brick is a small piece, and a platform tends to be a much larger entity. The clean line of distinction between those two terms is not so clean, so there is overlap, and some people like calling their thing a platform, and others like calling it a brick. And then we even have code references, so it gets a little more complicated. But one of the things that we've implemented in our company is a library, a consistency library, where a single repository that any R&D person can go to and find consistency rules, they can find brick references, they can find code references, and they can find platform references. And in that library, it will describe for them who made it, how to get access to it, who the contact is, and candidly, how much support they'll give you. So, because sometimes they'll make a code reference, hey, I did this little sample thing, and they'll put it up, and they're like, please don't call me. I'm not here to be your brick supplier, but if it helps you, great. If it doesn't, no biggie. Or there's other groups that basically make their living inside the company making bricks. So they are full service. They'll even customize bricks for you. So it varies. And so we want to make sure that the people who are not that committed but are willing to share aren't penalized. So they're, okay, just tell us what you're willing to support, and we put it in the library. And then when you get to the platform side, we have a brand called EcoStruxure, and this is our platform for IoT. So it's one of the challenges with our early IoT was that everybody went out and negotiated their own contracts with some cloud provider and then built their own stacks and it really is and created their own communications and made their own gateways, and it really became a bit of a fiasco. So one of the company investments is in this IoT platform, because this EcoStruxure and digital systems is one of the big trends. And I mentioned IIoT and IoT, and this is certainly one of the leading areas for companies like us. So we wanted to make sure we had a platform that we could build on that was secure, robust, reliable, and we could make sure that was manageable under contractual obligations. So we've built this platform, and it will support most cases. Let's say you want to do energy management of a building, so you want to monitor all the bank of meters in this large building, because I can tell you a building like this doesn't have 1 meter. So you have meters, especially if you're an industrial or commercial building. You meter out so you can charge out to the different groups. So you need to collect all these meters. These meters are not directly connected. They connect to a gateway, and the gateway connects to the hosted application. So you want to make sure that gateway to hosted application is secure, because you don't want people attacking through the meter or through the gateway to the hosted. We're not so concerned about the gateway, although that could be a problem. We don't want the hosted system to be attacked, so you want to make sure that vector is secure. So it's very important that we manage authorization, authentication, and then data storage in a secure way. So the next thing is applying IT principles. So the kind of designs that we are trying to implement is the integrity. How do we manage the integrity of a device? How do we manage it from software, and then also patching? So we need to make sure we don't forget that patches also are going to be sent out, and they need to be make sure that they are secure from so the asset owner who receives it knows it came from us. Another area that we're working very heavily on, and you'll see two kinds of authentication authorization. It's one thing to have the person log in to access a system, but there's also the fact that this one system talking to another system, do they trust each other? And that machine-to-machine authentication is a big area of challenge for us to implement, because we want to make sure we have a mechanism that the systems can be decommissioned. I didn't talk a whole lot about our supply chain, but the vast majority of what we sell are boxes. And those boxes get sold to a customer, and that customer or a system integrator or somebody puts these systems together. In some cases it's us, in most cases it's not. So I'm selling a box that then there has to be some way to configure machine-to-machine authentication so that when a PLC A is sending a command to PLC B, PLC B knows it's coming from PLC A and not spoofed PLC A. Because that's one of the, obviously an attack vector is attack it by pretending that you're somebody else. So it could be a user, but it also could be a machine. You also have authorization. So this machine talks to that machine. Is this machine authorized to write to that machine? Or is this machine only authorized to read from that machine? It gets into authorization levels. Of course, user authorization levels is a bigger deal. And so one of our challenges is, instead of authorization of me and what I'm allowed to do versus what you're allowed to do, it would be, I'm this classification of person, and this classification of person is allowed to do these actions, and this other classification is only allowed to do these other actions. We call that role-based access control. So role-based access control is not a new concept. Implementing it into these systems is where we're working on our quote-unquote innovative design. And one of the biggest challenges on these is that a lot of these are done based on certificates, and certificates validate themselves to a CA, which in most cases is on the network. But a lot of these systems are isolated. So they have nowhere to go. So we have to have some kind of authentication and authorization mechanism that's local, which is not a technical challenge to make it local. It's a technical challenge to keep it maintained. So these are kind of the challenges we've been working through. Device authenticity, we do have problems with counterfeit. So we want to make sure that whatever device is installed is ours. It's not somebody counterfeiting our equipment. We've had issues with that in, I'm not pointing at China, but I do know we did have some in China, probably more, not communication devices, more breakers. But it's a general problem of, is it really your equipment or not? The other one that's really interesting and a big challenge for us, and we've been dealing with this ever since we started the networking, is device replacement. So what happens at 3 in the morning when a drive fails? Normally what happens is the motor stopped running, you go out, you see there's an error light or smoke is coming out of the panel, or there's some indicator that, hey, the drive failed. So they go in, they have a screwdriver, big screwdriver, because these are usually big 3-phase lugs. They undo it. Then they take the unit off the wall. They put the new unit on the wall. They wire it back in, and they turn it back on to get the motor running. But you now have an authentication mechanism that says, I recognize that device with that certificate. I don't know who this guy is. So your communication system now has to recognize that I've changed, I'm somebody else. And is that person qualified and trained to change the authentication mechanism to get all, and how are all these whitelisted tables set up, and how do you, so from a system standpoint, this becomes a real problem. So all the advantages you've just done for authentication works great until you have to replace it with somebody who's not properly trained. And what mechanisms can automatically happen in order to make this replaceable without having to reconfigure or bring in a level 4 technician? Logging and auditing, so what are you logging? How are you protecting the logs? How often do you transfer them? How do you transfer them securely? Not insurmountable problems, but a lot of these devices don't have a lot of storage, so they're not exactly sitting there with a gig of storage and if they're not networked, then how do they, you can roll them, of course, but what are you logging, and how do you make sure that log then is interpretable somewhere down the road? And of course, robustness, because the best attack is just slam it and cause it to go belly up. So we talk about the security principles, and we emphasize the safety is also a very important principle. So when it comes to integrity, we developed, for software signing, we developed a utility, and this kind of not so secure, but we developed a utility that allowed our teams to sign their software. We're upgrading that now to a more advanced, but we want to provide this to our development team so they're not figuring out their own solution for how to sign software. Coming with firmware, though, we did not use a public PKI. We do our own self-signed PKI. So this is something we're still rolling out, but it's still fairly immature, but it is a challenge that we think will be the right thing. We have to do this for firmware. We got a lot of work to do in this area, but it is the direction we're going. And then, of course, patch signing is still trying to convince people, hey, you need to sign the patch. And then signing it's not so hard, but how do you validate it? We have engineering tools, you have devices. Sometimes the device can be updated without the engineering tool, so where's the validation take place? And this whole workflow is still kind of new for us. So this is the path we're going on integrity. We are working on a certificate-based authentication, both machine-to-machine and user-to-machine. So this is something in fact, we just had a workshop a couple weeks ago figuring out across our business units how we're going to implement this, because we have different, and then with authorization, we agree on authorization, but we have different opinions on how to implement authorization. So as always, there's a little, not everything is, you can't come down from the top and say, thou shalt. It just doesn't seem to work so well. But this is an area that's, that we do recognize the value of, and we all have the same principle in place, but there's some technical differences in how we're implementing. But we are still going to be doing authorization through the certificate. So this is still our biggest problem. One of our groups, and probably all the groups, will end up using some kind of appliance, which will be able to either you'll be able to, the user, some user will be able to go in and fix whatever needs to be fixed, but it's got to be simple to use. So this is probably one of our biggest challenges, to make it easy to use. But this is kind of the approach that we're taking, which will probably, because you can't, if you can't authenticate to the network, then you're going to have to authenticate locally. And if you can't just say, well, I won't authenticate, then your certificate's a waste of time if you're not authenticating to something that you trust. So we are working on standard format and how to protect log files. So this would fall into one of those bricks that this is how you should be writing logs and how you should be protecting your logs and making sure that the content in the logs can't be manipulated, because they're useless if anyone can get control of them. So that's one of the areas. So we are starting to put these into embedded devices. As I said, a lot of the embedded devices we have don't have a lot of resources, so they'll require probably redesigns to do proper logging. So this is one of the, sometimes it might seem obvious, just put that functionality in there. But if the product was already designed, it might not have the capacity to do it. So that forces a redesign, which puts you into a different part of the product redesign cycle, because they might not be funded or ready to redesign the product for a security issue, unless, of course, a customer required it. So, so if you catch it, you might not ever get a redesign of that product. The roadmap might be a new product. So these are the things that we deal with in this area. Secure communication. So one of the things that people have asked for is, how do you protect these industrial protocols that are passing data in clear text? So the two networks that are most prevalent for us are Modbus and Ethernet IP. Modbus is probably the best known, but Ethernet IP is one we use for control. Both of these have secure implementations that we are working on, so we'll be able to provide those in a reasonable time frame. The adoption of Modbus, the problem with Modbus is that it's so prevalent, and there's so many people that have Modbus drivers that it'll be challenging to implement. But so part of our implementation needs to be a handshake that says, do you have TLS? No? Okay, then we revert back to standard. If you have TLS, okay, let's handshake. Now we can encrypt the communication. Robustness. So for robustness, we use a test called Achilles, which is a fuzz tester for network. We have another tool that does something equivalent to that. So the only advantage of Achilles is at the end I can put a stamp on it to my product, and there's some market value to that. Sadly, I've had product people come up to me and say, our product is secure. What do you mean it's secure? Well, we have Achilles. I'm like, yeah, no, that's not secure. That's robust. So it tends to have this persona now for novices that it means your product is secure. So we have to correct some of that knowledge, but it's better than nothing, and it does do a valid test of the network from a robustness standpoint. So we do have another tool called Codenomicon that does basically the same thing. So we're able to use both of those tools. And sometimes when you're going through the millions of test cases, one might find something pop up and the other will miss. So it does help to have a suite of tools. And Codenomicon has better protocol fuzzing suite. So there's opportunities to test protocols that Achilles might not have. So, and then the areas of innovation that we're looking at right now for asset authenticity is blockchain. We're not really sure how to use it yet. We just heard that this word seems to be, it's kind of like a Game of Thrones picture. You need to have this in your lexicon somewhere, even if you're not really sure why. So we're not sure why, but we got it here. So we're looking at it. We're working on the use cases to see if it really makes sense. One of the questions is, does it make sense when you're in an isolated environment? And that's probably one of our bigger questions. Again, the custom fuzzers I made reference to. When it's not internet connected, how do we pass these certificate authentication messages through? How do we validate the genuineness of a device? This requires more than just a certificate because somebody could literally write firmware onto a device. So how do you put in secure memory something that is unique to that device that can be validated? So this is what we call device genuineness, and it's really another level beyond secure boot. It's not just making sure the firmware is right, but it's making sure the hardware actually has not been manipulated. And so validating integrity of a embedded device or an application program, it's one thing to validate the integrity of the firmware, but then suppose somebody changes the configuration of the program. And you say, well, we just trust whatever the program is. Well, the easiest thing to do is change the program, because most PLCs have a protect switch that are turned off because it's just a pain in the neck. So you change the program, you can change the program in no time. So this is like our next level of challenge, is how do we implement a mechanism to test the integrity of either the configuration or the application program. And then one of the big topics is where security and safety intersect. And when I talk about safety, I'm talking about safety machines, safety protocols. They do have an intersection with security, and there are IEC standard committees working on this intersection. So one more obvious Game of Thrones reference. So the other part of our challenge is that a lot of our customers, as I mentioned, are not as sophisticated as we think they should be, and don't even understand that they should be doing simple things like change your password. So one of our activities is to educating our customers and channel partners about what I call the 7 rules of security, that I call the golden rules, which are very obvious things, but most of them don't pay attention to this. They don't think about patching. They don't think about the life cycle of their passwords. IT people obviously do. This is inherent in it's in their DNA. OT people don't think this way. So making them sensitive to these types of things, protect your passwords, making sure that your network is segmented properly. And I think I don't know how accurate the data point is, but 80% of cyber attacks started with somebody opening an email they shouldn't have opened. Educate your people. Be cognizant that you are constantly being phished, and you never know what's going to happen. But pretty much every major breach you've heard about started with a phishing attack, because that's how they got in. And whether it's, I believe that's how Equifax, I think OPM was that way. Most of these big attacks are I think it was WannaCry came in that way. They're all, somebody opens an email, and then, as we like to say, either they go and camp out and work their way around, or all hell breaks loose. So you never know, depends on what the attack is, but educate your people and monitor your system. So that's the other thing we keep trying to tell people. Don't just assume once it's installed, it's good. Are there any questions? There's a few minutes.
Fred, we do have a question from online. We can start there.
Okay.
So from your experience, how long does it take until the customer discovers and reports a potential compromise? And does Schneider work with EISAC or DHS with regards to threat sharing?
As always, the answer is it depends. Some customers, the attacks could be going on for months. Some of the attacks that we've had were pretty obvious and pretty straightforward, and in fact were not even attacks. But some of them, we've even been attacked. So as a victim, and we didn't find out. We found out about it because somebody told us. We didn't even detect it in our own system. So we learned a pretty hard lesson from there. But I would say a sophisticated attacker can reside in your network for months without being detected if they're careful and they don't make any sudden moves. So it really depends on what you're monitoring. We work with DHS, ICS CERT very actively. We don't work so much with the EISAC at this point. My experience was, and maybe I'm incorrect, but I thought the ISACs discouraged vendors from participating. I thought they were users. I might be wrong about that, but most of our work is with DHS, ICS CERT, and we work actively with them, both the vulnerability desk as well as the incident response. Although I understand their incident response desk has kind of gone away, so that's what I heard at least. Hope that answers the question.
So I'll ask my own questions. You talked a lot about systemic security throughout, the Schneider portfolio and how you're operating in that. What have you found is the biggest challenge in addressing security or enabling future-looking security in relation to delivering products in the ICS space?
Sure. The biggest hurdle we have is probably the tension between the business side and the security side. And the business side is I have a window to launch a product. I'm getting competitive pressure. I need new features. I need this put in the product, and I need it now. And I got a project, or I'm getting threatened by competitors to unseat me. So there's this business tension. And then we're saying, well, we need to put this capability in the product. And they see that as a distraction from what they view as their immediate, right in front of their nose problem. That's kind of quieted down a little bit. We're getting better attention, but it's not like a light switch went off and they're like, oh, thank you. Now I understand why you want all this capability. It takes a while, and it happens a piece at a time. And the place where it happens the fastest is when a customer makes an issue out of it. When we get a customer request that says, why aren't you doing this? Or what about that? That causes an immediate reaction. When we're the ones selling that internally, it's a little harder. Candidly, in the last couple years, we now have visibility at the top of the company for both, because I mentioned the event we've had internally. We get more customers asking us about security than we used to, and our company is more concerned now about reputation and the risks of that. So we have better senior management awareness than we used to, which is positive. As it gets down and it gets into the operational side, that's where the tension is. So we have to work on convincing of the value of that and catching them at the right point in the development cycle.
Quick follow-up, if I may, since you talked about the challenges. What has been the biggest success or the most successful thing that's caused impact in that transition that you just talked about in understanding from management or from customers, or what? Was it something Schneider has done, or something that the federal government has done, or some combination of that?
Customers. Customer demand.
Purely just customer demand.
I'm not saying the others were zero, but I'm saying if I was going to rate what caused a shift in a group, customer demand was by far the single largest pressure point to get people to shift their mind. And I saw it in multiple groups. A project would come up that they want to go after, and it's written into the spec, or a customer is threatening them to pull it because they don't have the capability, and they're reacting. Sometimes you got to mitigate, you can't remediate, but that almost always causes the difference. The government, there's some countries where government's involved, but most cases the government for us, so also in the US, the government interaction with us is they're a customer. So they're not, so when you say government, I'm thinking more of the customer aspect of the government, not the regulatory or standards part of the government. So that's what I'm reacting to, because we sell to Department of Defense, we sell to, I'm sure Department of Energy, we sell to the major labs, Oak Ridge, and et cetera. And you might not like to hear this, but I understand we also sell to the Russian military. And I was told that one product was even going to go shipboard on a Russian military ship. I'm like, but we're a global company, and we have footprints in places you probably don't want to know about. But that's a different discussion.
I have a question to ask.
Sure.
My first one is about this notion of big data. With multiple sensors we have deployed in the field, like in the power system, it's by billion. So if you ask a power system guy about the big data, he will be saying is this avalanche of data coming from MI, coming from PMU. I want to ask you a question as a cyber. What is a big data for you?
Well, if I go back to that drawing, that hosted system, there was a big data, I guess they call themselves, a big data environment. And it's a very large database that allows you to put data in any kind of way and then be able to sit above it with analytic engine and interpret it. So it's the big data is the analytics, which is the one who makes sense out of it. Just having a huge data storage, I think the going away from SQL and to these other, I'm not a database expert, I'll start with that, but going to these other environments allows them to store massive amounts of data in a much simpler way. But they're really of no value unless you have the analytics to take advantage of it. And so the whole game is the analytics. The whole game is being able to take data that's been collected over a period of time and from different points and make sense out of it and give an answer to somebody who's trying to make a decision. So we focus on it. If I'm doing a building management, we'll focus on it as far as how do you optimize the pricing of your energy usage, or how do you make sure that your building is tuned to operate efficiently. We're not doing customer behavior kind of stuff like that. We don't do that. But that's what, so big data might not be very big compared to some of the bigger consumer type stuff. But that's what we consider. It's just a large population of just collected data. And then the key thing is the analytic engine on top that's making sense out of it and giving decision criteria to someone to act on it. And that's what so we have a platform, and that's what we use it for, but it's, I don't know if that, hopefully that, at least that's our context of it.
Well, let's thank our speaker.